The Rolls-Royce limousine stopped smoothly in front of Le Jardin, one of Dubai's most exclusive restaurants. The valet rushed to open the door, and Khalil Al-Rashid emerged like a king leaving his palace. At 48 years old, this oil magnate carried his $4 billion not just in the bank, but in his haughty posture, his $15,000 Armani suit, and the Patek Philippe that gleamed on his wrist. "Good evening, Mr. Al-Rashid," greeted the maitre d', bowing slightly. "Your private table is ready." Khalil didn't even look at the man. His eyes swept the environment like a predator assessing his territory. The restaurant was perfect by his standards. Baccarat crystals, authentic Persian rugs, and a clientele that breathed money and power. "Have the British investors arrived?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been contradicted. "Yes, sir. They're waiting in the private room." As he walked through the main hall, Khalil noticed how conversations diminished in his wake. Executives whispered his name. Diamond-clad women followed him with admiring gazes. He smiled internally. This was the respect his empire had earned. That's when he saw her. Sarah Mitchell, 28, was adjusting a nearby table with precise and elegant movements. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her black uniform was impeccable but modest. There was something in her posture, a quiet dignity that caught his attention for a brief moment before his arrogance took over. "You," he called out sharply, snapping his fingers like summoning a dog. "Bring champagne to the private room. Dom Perignon, 2010. Sarah looked up, her green eyes meeting his for a moment. "Of course, sir, right away." Her voice was soft but clear, with an American accent that immediately categorized her in Khalil's mind. Another foreigner working in the Gulf for money. He didn't wait for her response, already moving toward the private dining room where 3 British investors sat discussing quarterly reports. "Gentlemen," Khalil announced his arrival like a conquering general, "I hope Dubai is treating you well." James Morrison, the lead investor, stood with a practiced smile. "Mr. Al-Rashid, thank you for meeting with us. We're very excited about the North Sea project." As they settled into leather chairs around a mahogany table that cost more than most people's cars, Khalil felt that familiar rush of power. These men needed him more than he needed them. His oil reserves in the UAE were the key to their British energy independence project. "Before we begin," Khalil said, loosening his silk tie slightly, "let me be clear about one thing. I don't do small partnerships. Either we're talking about a minimum $2 billion investment, or we're wasting each other's time." The investors exchanged glances. Morrison cleared his throat. "Of course, we're prepared to discuss those figures." A soft knock interrupted them. Sarah entered carrying a silver tray with the champagne and crystal flutes. She moved with practiced grace, setting down each glass without making a sound. Khalil watched, her peripherally noting how she tried to remain invisible. "The Dom Perignon 2010, sir," she said quietly, beginning to pour. "Finally," Khalil muttered in English. "At least someone here knows how to follow simple instructions." Sarah's hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she poured his glass, but she said nothing. The British investors smiled politely and continued their conversation about offshore drilling rights. As Sarah finished pouring and prepared to leave, Khalil felt that familiar urge to establish dominance. In his world, power meant putting others in their place, especially those he deemed beneath him. "Wait," he called out as she reached the door. Sarah turned, her expression professionally neutral. "Bring us some of those appetizers, what do you call them?" He snapped his fingers impatiently. "The small food." "Canapes, sir?" "Yes, whatever. And make sure they're fresh. I don't pay these prices for day-old food." "Certainly, sir." As the doctor closed behind her, Morrison leaned forward. "Your staff is very professional." Khalil waved dismissively. "They should be for what this place charges. Now, about those drilling licenses." But even as he dove into negotiations about billion-dollar oil contracts, a small part of his mind lingered on the waitress. Something about her reaction when he spoke. No, he was imagining things. She was just another service worker, grateful for the tip she'd receive at the end of the night. If only he knew how wrong he was. If you've ever witnessed someone being judged too quickly, leave a comment below. You won't believe what happens next in this story of assumptions and shocking revelations. 20 minutes into the dinner, Khalil was in his element. The contract negotiations were flowing in his favor, and the British investors were practically begging for his participation. He savored these moments when his power was most evident. The geological surveys show untapped reserves worth approximately 50 billion, James Morrison was saying, sliding documents across the table. With your expertise in Gulf extraction methods. Sarah returned with a selection of canapes arranged on fine porcelain plates. She moved quietly around the table, placing small plates beside each guest. The conversation never paused. In Khalil's world, service staff were invisible unless they made mistakes. These numbers are conservative, Khalil said, examining the geological reports. In my experience, British estimates are always 20% below actual yield. As Sarah leaned slightly to place Morrison's plate, her sleeve brushed against Khalil's champagne glass. The movement was barely perceptible, but it was enough to send a few drops of Dom Perignon onto the edge of his contract papers. The room fell silent. Khalil's face darkened as he stared at the wet spots on the documents. The drops hadn't damaged anything significant, but in his mind, this was an unforgivable transgression. "Are you serious right now?" he said, his voice dangerously low. Sarah immediately grabbed her napkin. "I'm so sorry, sir. Let me—" "Don't touch anything else." Khalil's voice exploded through the room. The British investors shifted uncomfortably, not sure whether to intervene or pretend nothing was happening. Sarah stood frozen, the napkin still. Her face flushed with embarrassment, and then Khalil made his fatal mistake. Switching to Arabic, his voice dripping with contempt, he unleashed a torrent of insults that he was certain she couldn't understand. He spoke about how this stupid American girl didn't deserve to work in a place like this, how she had probably never seen a champagne glass in her life, how these foreigners come to their country and don't even know how to carry a tray properly. He continued, his voice getting louder, enjoying the performance, saying maybe they should send her to work in a fast food restaurant where she belongs. At least there she won't ruin billion-dollar contracts. The British investors sat in stunned silence. They couldn't understand the words, but Khalil's tone made his meaning crystal clear. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Al-Rashid, perhaps we could—" "Let me finish," Khalil cut him off, still glaring at Sarah. In Arabic, he delivered what he thought would be his final blow, telling her to get out before she ruins something else and to learn how to carry things before coming back to work in a classy place like this. The room was dead silent. Sarah stood perfectly still, her green eyes focused on Khalil's face. Something had changed in her expression. The embarrassment was gone, replaced by something else entirely. Khalil leaned back in his chair, satisfied with his performance. He had established dominance, put the clumsy waitress in her place, and shown the British investors how decisively he handled problems. That's when Sarah spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, and utterly confident as she replied in perfect, classical Arabic. "Dignity is not measured by money, and respect cannot be bought with gold. A wise person knows that small mistakes reveal true character." The silence that followed was deafening. Khalil's mouth fell open. The champagne glass he was holding slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. Morrison and the other investors stared in complete shock, their eyes darting between Khalil and Sarah. But Sarah wasn't finished. Her voice remained steady, her pronunciation flawless as she continued. Imam Ali said, "The worth of every person is in what they do well. Perhaps we should ask ourselves, what do we truly do well?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Khalil sat frozen, his face pale, his entire worldview cracking like the champagne glass at his feet. Morrison broke the silence with a slow clap. I don't understand Arabic, but that was clearly extraordinary." Sarah bowed slightly, her composure never wavering. If you'll excuse me, I'll have someone clean up the glass." As she turned to leave, one of the younger British investors whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Did a waitress just school a billionaire in his own language?" Subscribe to see how this shocking revelation completely changes everything. The truth about Sarah is more incredible than anyone could imagine. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Khalil stared at the door through which Sarah had just exited, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The woman he had dismissed as an ignorant foreigner had not only understood every word of his Arabic insults, but had responded with eloquence that would impress university professors. "Mr. Al-Rashid." Morrison's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "Are you all right?" Khalil blinked, suddenly aware that 3 pairs of British eyes were studying him intently. His carefully cultivated image of unshakable authority was crumbling before their eyes. She speaks Arabic," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Apparently quite well," replied David Chen, the youngest investor. "What did she say to you?" Khalil's throat felt dry. How could he explain that a waitress had just delivered a philosophical lesson about character and dignity that cut straight to his soul? How could he admit that her words had been more profound than most of the conversations in his billionaire circles? "It was nothing," he lied, reaching for his water glass with a hand that trembled slightly. "Just tourist phrases." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. What Sarah had spoken wasn't tourist Arabic. It was classical, literary Arabic, the kind taught in the finest universities, the kind used in poetry and philosophical discourse, the kind that required years of dedicated study to master. Morrison exchanged a meaningful glance with his colleagues. "Perhaps we should take a break. You seem unsettled." "I'm fine," Khalil snapped, trying to regain his composure. A clumsy waitress isn't going to disrupt a multi-billion-dollar deal. But his hands were still shaking as he pretended to study. The contract documents. The words swam before his eyes as his mind replayed Sarah's response. The way she had quoted Imam Ali, one of the most revered figures in Islamic philosophy. The way her pronunciation had been flawless, her grammar impeccable. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. A different server entered. A young man with nervous eyes. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I'm here to clean up the broken glass." As the server swept up the crystal shards, Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Al-Rashid, I have to ask, where did you find staff who speak Arabic at that level? Our London restaurants would pay handsomely for that kind of cultural knowledge." Khalil felt heat rising in his cheeks. "I don't hire the wait staff here. I just eat here." "Well, someone should give that young woman a promotion," Chen added. "That level of linguistic skill is rare. I studied Arabic at Cambridge for 2 years and couldn't follow half of what she said." Cambridge. The word hit Khalil like a physical blow. If someone who had studied Arabic at one of the world's finest universities couldn't follow Sarah's speech, then what exactly was her background? "She probably just memorized a few phrases," Khalil said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mr. Al-Rashid," Morrison said gently, "I've been in international business for 20 years. I know the difference between memorized phrases and fluent discourse. That woman wasn't reciting, she was thinking in Arabic." The conversation was interrupted by another knock. This time Sarah herself entered, carrying a fresh champagne glass and a small silver tray. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, her voice professional but somehow different now. "I've brought a replacement glass, and the manager would like to comp your dessert course for the inconvenience." She moved to Khalil's place setting, her movements as graceful as before, but now he watched her differently. How had he missed the intelligence in her eyes? The poise that spoke of education, not just training. As she set down the new glass, Morrison couldn't contain his curiosity. "Excuse me, miss, what's your name?" "Sarah Mitchell, sir." "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me asking, but where did you learn to speak Arabic so beautifully?" Sarah's eyes flickered to Khalil for just a moment. He saw something there. Not anger, not triumph, but something that looked almost like pity? "I studied Middle Eastern literature at Oxford," she said simply. "I specialized in classical Arabic, poetry, and Islamic philosophy. The words hit the room like a bomb. Oxford, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Classical Arabic poetry. Islamic philosophy. Khalil felt the blood drain from his face. He had just insulted an Oxford-educated scholar in her area of expertise. He had called her ignorant while she was probably more knowledgeable about Arabic literature than he was. Chen leaned forward, clearly fascinated. "Oxford, that's incredible. What brought you to Dubai?" Sarah's smile was polite but guarded. "Life circumstances change. Sometimes you do what you need to do." "But surely," Morrison pressed, "with credentials like that, you could be working at the British Embassy or consulting for international firms." "Perhaps," Sarah said diplomatically. "Right now, this is where I need to be." As she turned to leave, Khalil found his voice. "Wait." Sarah paused, turning back with that same professional expression. Khalil struggled with words that had never been difficult before. "I didn't realize your educational background." "Most people don't ask," Sarah replied simply. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" The casual way she dismissed his half-apology stung more than anger would have. She wasn't even giving him the chance to make amends properly. After she left, the room remained quiet for several minutes. Finally, Morrison spoke. "Mr. Al-Rashid, I think we should address what just happened." "It's not relevant to our business?" "Actually, it is," Chen interrupted. "We're considering a partnership that will require cultural sensitivity, international cooperation, and respect for diverse teams. What we just witnessed—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Khalil realized with growing horror that he had just humiliated himself in front of potential business partners. Worse, he had revealed a side of his character that could jeopardize everything he'd worked to build. But the worst part was the growing realization that his embarrassment wasn't about the business deal. It was about the look in Sarah's eyes when she had called him wise. She hadn't meant it as a compliment. If you're feeling the tension build, hit that like button. The next revelation will leave everyone speechless, including Khalil himself. Khalil couldn't focus on the contract negotiations. Every few minutes, his mind drifted back to Sarah's words, to the quiet dignity in her voice, to the growing realization that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The offshore drilling rights would be structured as a 60-40 partnership, Morrison was explaining. But his words seemed to come from underwater. "Mr. Al-Rashid." Chen's voice cut through his mental fog. "Did you hear the proposed timeline?" "Yes, of course," Khalil lied, straightening in his chair. "Continue." But even as he tried to engage with the multi-billion-dollar deal that should have been the highlight of his month, he kept glancing toward the door. Part of him hoped Sarah would return. Another part dreaded facing her again. 20 minutes later, his phone buzzed, a text from his assistant. "The Al Maktoum minister moved tomorrow's meeting to tonight. Says it's urgent. Should I confirm?" Khalil frowned. The last thing he needed was another complication, but refusing a minister from one of Dubai's ruling families wasn't an option. "Gentlemen, I apologize, but I need to take this call," he said, stepping away from the table. As he spoke quietly with his assistant in the corner, he noticed Sarah serving another table across the restaurant. She was explaining something to an elderly couple, her hands moving gracefully as she spoke. Even from a distance, he could see the warmth in her smile, the patient way she listened to their questions. How had he been so blind? When he returned to the table, Morrison was checking his watch. "Actually, Mr. Al-Rashid, perhaps we should wrap up for tonight. We have an early flight tomorrow." "Of course," Khalil agreed, though part of him was relieved. He needed time to process what had happened. As the British investors gathered their documents, Chen paused. "Would it be possible to speak with Sarah again before we leave? I'd love to get her thoughts on some cultural considerations for our London operations." Khalil's stomach tightened. "I'm sure she's busy." "Actually," Morrison added, "that's an excellent idea. Cultural consultants with her background charge thousands per day in London." Before Khalil could object, Morrison had already signaled to Sarah, who approached their table with that same professional grace. "Yes, sir. How may I help you?" "Sarah," Morrison began, "we were hoping you might spare a few minutes to discuss something. We're British investors working on projects in the Middle East, and frankly, we could use guidance from someone with your expertise." Sarah glanced at Khalil, then back to Morrison. "I'm working right now, but I'd be happy to speak briefly." "Wonderful. First, could you tell us about your background? Oxford is impressive, but what specifically did you study?" Sarah settled into the chair they offered, her posture straight but relaxed. "I completed my master's in Middle Eastern Studies with a focus on Arabic literature and Islamic philosophy. My thesis was on the intersection of classical Arabic poetry and modern diplomatic language." Chen's eyes widened. "That's incredibly specialized." "It is," Sarah agreed. "I also speak 6 languages fluently: Arabic, English, French, Spanish, Farsi, and Turkish. I spent 2 years in Cairo studying at Al-Azhar University and another year in Damascus before the conflict." Khalil felt like he was hearing about a completely different person. Al-Azhar was one of the most prestigious Islamic universities in the world. Damascus had been a center of Arabic cultural studies. This wasn't just education. This was deep, serious scholarship. "What brought you to Dubai?" Morrison asked gently. For the first time, Sarah's professional composure wavered slightly. "My parents were diplomats. They died in a car accident 18 months ago, and I needed to settle their affairs, pay off debts. Sometimes life requires you to take whatever work is available while you figure out your next steps." The words hung heavy in the air. Khalil felt something twist in his stomach. Not just embarrassment now, but genuine shame. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Chen said quietly. "Thank you." Sarah's voice was steady again. "They taught me that honest work has dignity, regardless of what form it takes." Morrison leaned forward. "Sarah, I have to ask. When Mr. Al-Rashid spoke to you in Arabic earlier, you understood everything, didn't you?" Sarah's eyes moved to Khalil's face. He saw no anger there, no desire for revenge, just a quiet sadness that cut deeper than fury would have. "Yes," she said simply. "I understood. And your response, could you translate it for us?" Khalil wanted to stop this, to end the conversation before his humiliation became complete, but he found himself frozen, waiting to hear his judgment rendered in English. "I said that dignity isn't measured by money, and respect can't be bought with gold. That wise people know small mistakes reveal true character." She paused, and I quoted Imam Ali, who said that every person's worth is in what they do well. Morrison and Chen exchanged glances. The weight of what had actually transpired was becoming clear to them. "Mr. Al-Rashid," Morrison said slowly, "you insulted an Oxford-educated scholar who speaks 6 languages and has studied at the finest universities in the Middle East. Because she spilled a drop of champagne?" Khalil's mouth opened, but no words came out. Sarah stood gracefully. "Gentlemen, I should return to my other tables. Good luck with your business ventures." "Wait," Chen called out. Would you consider consulting work? Serious consulting, I mean. We have projects across the Gulf states that could benefit from your expertise." Sarah paused. "That's very kind, but I'm committed to my current obligations." "What if those obligations changed?" Morrison asked, glancing meaningfully at Khalil. The implication was clear. They were questioning whether they wanted to do business with someone who treated people the way Khalil had treated Sarah. After Sarah left, the 3 men sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Morrison spoke. "Mr. Al-Rashid, I need to be direct. Our board includes several members who prioritize corporate social responsibility. What we witnessed tonight, it concerns us." "I made a mistake," Khalil said quietly. "Yes, you did," Chen agreed. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Khalil looked around the elegant restaurant, at the life of luxury and power he had built, at the respect he commanded through fear rather than earning it. For the first time in years, he felt truly small. I don't know, he admitted. Morrison nodded slowly. Well, that's more honest than most billionaires would be. We'll be in touch about the contract after we've had time to discuss things. As the British investors left, Khalil remained at the table, staring at the documents that suddenly seemed meaningless. Through the restaurant's windows, he could see Sarah serving other customers, treating each person with the same dignity and attention. She had every right to hate him, to expose him, to destroy his reputation with a single social media post. Instead, she had simply told the truth and returned to her work. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She was everything he pretended to be: educated, cultured, dignified, strong. And he had just revealed himself to be everything he despised. Share this story if you've ever witnessed someone's assumptions completely backfire. The final chapter will show you what true character really looks like. Khalil didn't leave the restaurant immediately. Long after the British investors had departed, he sat alone at the table, nursing a glass of water and watching Sarah work. She moved through the dining room with the same grace as before, but now, he saw it differently, not as subservience, but as professional excellence. She didn't avoid his section of the restaurant, but she didn't seek him out either. Finally, as the evening crowd began to thin, Khalil made a decision that surprised even himself. He stood and walked directly to Sarah's station near the kitchen doors. "Excuse me," he said quietly in English. "Sarah," she turned, her expression neutral but alert. "Yes, Mr. Al-Rashid. Could I speak with you for a moment, privately?" Sarah glanced around the restaurant, then nodded toward a quiet corner table. "I have a few minutes." They sat across from each other, and for the first time in decades, Khalil found himself truly at a loss for words. This woman, this scholar, this dignified person he had tried to humiliate, waited patiently for him to speak. "I owe you an apology," he began, then stopped. "No, that's not enough. I owe you much more than that." Sarah remained silent, her green eyes steady on his face. "What I said to you." Khalil switched to Arabic, hoping he could express himself better in his native language. "It was unforgivable. Not just because you understood every word, but because no human being deserves to be spoken to that way." "Thank you," Sarah replied in Arabic, her voice soft. "But you should know, I've heard worse. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon." The casual way she said it made Khalil's shame burn deeper. "That doesn't make it acceptable." "No, it doesn't." Khalil leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "Tell me about your parents. You said they were diplomats?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "My father was the cultural attaché at the American Embassy in Jordan. My mother was a translator for the UN. They met in Cairo in 1995. And they encouraged your studies?" "They insisted on them. They believed that understanding other cultures was the foundation of peace." She paused. "They would have been disappointed in what happened tonight." The words cut deep, but Khalil knew he deserved them. "What are your plans?" The British investors weren't joking about consulting work. "With your background." "I'm applying to medical schools," Sarah said. "My parents' estate, there were debts. Medical school is expensive. I'm working to save money and pay off what they owed." "Medical school?" Khalil was stunned. "But your expertise in Arabic studies, your education, will make me a better doctor," Sarah finished. "I want to work with refugee populations, people who need medical care but face language barriers. My Arabic studies aren't a career. They're a tool to help people." Khalil stared at her, feeling like he was seeing a completely different species of human being. Here was someone who could command six-figure consulting fees, who could work for embassies or international corporations, choosing instead to serve others at the most basic level. "How much?" he asked quietly. "Excuse me?" "Medical school, how much do you need?" Sarah's expression cooled. "Mr. Al-Rashid, I'm not looking for charity." "It's not charity, it's restitution." Khalil pulled out his phone. "I want to do something right tonight." "You don't need to pay money to do something right," Sarah said firmly. Money isn't what was damaged here. Khalil set his phone down, confused. Then what? Respect, dignity, the assumption that people have value regardless of their current circumstances. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Mr. Al-Rashid, can I ask you something? Of course. How did you feel when you were young? When you had less money, less power? Did people treat you with respect then? The question hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly, Khalil was 15 years old again, working in his uncle's shop in Sharjah, watching wealthy customers dismiss him as irrelevant. He remembered the sting of being ignored, of having his intelligence questioned because of his clothes, his accent, his lack of connections. No, he whispered. They didn't. And how did that feel? Terrible, angry. I promised myself that when I had power, things would be different. But they're not different, Sarah said gently. You just switched sides. The truth of it knocked the breath out of him. All these years he'd been perpetuating the exact system that had once crushed him. He'd become the very type of person he'd once hated. What do I do? He asked, and was surprised to hear how young his voice sounded. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. Start small. Treat the next person you encounter, whatever their job, whatever their background, like. They matter, really matter. Listen to them, see them. That's it? It's harder than you think, Sarah said with a slight smile, especially when you're used to being the most important person in every room. Khalil nodded slowly. The British investors. They may not want to work with me after tonight. Then find partners who share your values, or develop values worth sharing. They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Khalil spoke. I want to help with medical school. Not as payment for tonight, but because someone like you should be helping people, not dealing with people like I was tonight. Sarah studied his face. Why? Because 18 months ago you lost your parents and your world changed completely. But instead of becoming bitter, instead of taking the easy path, you chose to work honestly while pursuing a dream of helping others. He struggled for the words. That's who I want to be. For the first time that evening, Sarah smiled. A real smile, not her professional one. Mr. Al-Rashid, can I give you some advice? Please. The person you want to be? You already are that person. You just need to let him out more often. 6 months later, Khalil Al-Rashid announced the establishment of the Cultural Bridge Foundation, dedicated to providing scholarships for students pursuing cross-cultural studies. The first recipient was Sarah Mitchell, who had been accepted to Johns Hopkins Medical School. But more importantly, Khalil had quietly begun implementing changes in how his companies treated employees. He instituted mandatory cultural sensitivity, training, established anonymous feedback systems, and personally reviewed any complaints about workplace dignity. The British investors did sign their contract, after Khalil demonstrated his commitment to change through actions, not just words. Sarah sent him a photo from her first day of medical school, wearing scrubs and smiling in a hospital corridor. The note attached was simple. Thank you for seeing who I really was, even when I was just carrying a tray. Khalil kept that photo on his desk, next to a small card with a quote from Imam Ali. The worth of every person is in what they do well. It reminded him daily that true wealth isn't measured in billions. It's measured in how many people you lift up along the way. Sometimes the most expensive lessons in life come free, delivered by someone carrying a champagne glass and speaking truths that money can't buy. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that everyone has a story worth hearing. Subscribe for more tales of transformation, respect, and the power of seeing people for who they truly are.